Okay. There's two reasons why I thought this would be a good study for us today. One is based on an experience that I had last Monday night. And I know some of you are going to say, well, Skip, why do you keep going to those Bible studies? Well, it's a real good Bible study, and it's very rare that the facilitator of the group will say something that gets under my skin so bad that I feel I have to make a response. And what he said the other night can be taken more ways than one. I took it in a negative light. I took it that he was degrading the law of God. And now he doesn't believe that the we need to be observing the law at all. But he said uh, that in Exodus chapters 21 and 22, that those are case law. And I don't know, maybe it just hit me wrong. Tommy and I've talked about this, and maybe I shouldn't have gotten as upset as I did, but I I responded and I said, I mean, why are you calling them case law? It's coming straight out of God's mouth to Moses. Maybe somewhere down the road it could uh, be used in some case, but it doesn't come out of God's mouth as case law. And so, like I say, maybe it hit me wrong. I don't know, but I wasn't real happy about it. But I think I was fairly uh, non-combative, hopefully, with my
Skip,
response. Yeah.
what do you mean by case law?
Yeah, I
Never
was
heard
about
that
to
term.
ask that same question. Is he referencing the law itself as God gave it is case law, or what the Pharisees did after they came out of Babylon being case law?
He wasn't talking about the Pharisees after they came out of Babylon. He was talking about chapters 21 and 22, which I'll just pull them up and you'll see
Okay.
what he's talking. In effect, he was saying that it's like the oral law. The oral law is case law,
Oh,
something,
wow.
something that happened and, uh,
This is I'm blown away here because I find it's funny how the Spirit works, Skip, because my girls are leading the Bible study today in Paducah. Rian is with Wavy. This is the exact chapter and issues they're bringing up in church today.
wow, interesting.
This whole issue is they're having arguments with friends that are making similar arguments. Isn't that amazing? So
It really
apparently Yahweh wants us to talk about this.
So I'm not, I'd like to get a confirmation from Barb that sh her question was answered. Um, what is a definition of case law? That would be my interpretation of what Barb was asking. And I would answer it and say that this is judges' renderings in court. Um, is that what the guy meant, Skip?
Yeah, I think that Tommy, do you want to jump in here? It didn't offend Tommy as much as it did me.
No, I don't think I don't think he was trying to be offensive or provocative. He just made some comments about it, and of course, people are going to react to comments in their own ways. So I didn't react to it. I didn't recoil from it, but to me, I'm not sure. I really wasn't sure exactly what the guy was talking about. I mean, he's been to school too. Some of you have been to seminary or you've been to your Bible college. well, he's been to an equivalent of that, so he's knowledgeable. And he may have just mentioned that word as case law and uh, uh, did not. I don't think. Well, I'm rambling. I'm not sure exactly uh, um, his distinctions there. He just made a couple of comments about it, and then Skip brought this up too, and I thought they agreed, actually. But as to the depth of which they are to be followed, I think that was a question.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to buttress Mark's query to Barb as regarding the definition of case law. We mentioned that about a judge's ruling, but a judge's ruling is based on existing established law, basing on how that law is to be applied in a specific case, and then his judgment upon the written law and how it applies then takes precedent in terms of how the law is to be viewed and seen in the future.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I was saying to him. I said, Joe, these can't be case law. They're coming straight out of God's mouth. Look what it says here, chapter 21. I don't know how if y'all can see it, but it says, from God to Moses. Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. There's no case that's occurred. Because I agree 100% with what Mark, what all of you have said. A case law is a law that's made after a case has occurred, after a situation. These are laws straight out of God's mouth. So anyway, that's what I believe, and I do believe that he was, because he doesn't believe in observing the law anyway. But I think that's why he was calling them case law, because these would work if there were a case that they came up against. Well, there's no case. So anyway, I don't know if I'm making any sense or not, but um, he said that these chapters were part of the law that were case law. And I'm still not 100% sure how on earth he could say that about a law that went straight out of God's mouth to Moses. But
I mean,
anyway,
this is technically part of Torah, is it not?
yeah,
So
that's
if
right
this
in
is
the
part
middle
of
of Torah.
Torah, this is the law. This is the equivalent of the Constitution and the amendments. Well, they're not even amendments. This is just the Constitution. So case law would be something that would be established after the fact, that would be established by the period of judges about the law regarding a specific case. But as you said, Skip, this is the law itself. This is the Constitution. This is the foundational law of the land. So it's not case law here, at least as I understand it.
Right.
Well, case laws are, it's real simple. The guy made a decision based on the Ten Commandments, and then other people followed that decision, but it may not have been the correct decision. I mean, uh, for example, the Pharisees had all these rules that, presumably descended from, the Torah and other stuff, and and they were treated as law, but Jesus said, you know, that isn't the intent of it. That isn't what it meant. Your case was wrong and it should not be law.
Yeah, I mean, to give a modern context of what you're talking about, Jim. For example, was it Blackstone, the Supreme Court justice in the 50s, ruling on prayer in school? He's the guy that created the idea that there was a separation of church and state. And even though the First Amendment, the Constitution says what it says, he made a case law out of a court fight to suggest that there's to be a separation of anything regarding church or religion from anything the government does, and that becomes case law, and that becomes more important than the foundational law that it comes from. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
I use that illustration to kind of explain where, at least how I view case law. It takes the base law and either makes a rendering or a judgment or decision, and then that becomes that supersedes the law, for lack of a better word, in our modern parlance. Yeah, Tommy.
No, I was, that's an excellent example of case law. And many times courts or law attorneys will point to things and say, well, there's a precedent for that. In other words, I guess this is a case law that has been made in the past, and we can point to that as sort of a buttress for our position now. But this is, I guess they're assuming then that the case law that they're pointing to as a precedent was correct to start with. It may not have been. It may have been it may have been in error somehow, but they're pointing to it. Well, this is the law now because someone has used this before, and there's a precedent for it. I've marveled at that in the past.
Yeah. And it's my understanding that today kids that are going to law school don't study the Constitution that much. They study case law.
Right, and that's the whole Pharisaical system, Skip. The
Yeah.
Talmud is essentially case law of God's word. That's what the Talmud is.
Yeah.
In its entirety. It is like the law books we have. All the law books in their existence right now that you have, they're all interpretations of what they think that the Constitution should mean or how it should read in specific cases. And the Talmud, as the Jews, used it at the time of Christ and ever since, are the decisions rabbis made in regards to God's law.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I looked around for a scripture that backed up what he was saying. I mean, this is after the fact, but I thought, well, maybe I need to go find somewhere where it talks about case law. And sure enough, there are a lot of people, as I think one of you all just said, there are a lot of people that think these are case law. They're how you handle a specific situation. So the Hebrew word here is mishpat. And in the King James, it says, now these are the judgments, mishpat. In the New King James, I'm sorry, in the NASB, it says, now these are the ordinances, mishpat. In the NIV, these are the laws, mishpat. And in the New Living Second Translation, the real translation, it says regulations, mishpat. They're not as a result of some situation. These are straight out of God's mouth. But in the CEBA, and I can't remember, Tommy, do you remember what I said that was?
Not offhand, no.
Okay. Anyway, it's a translation, and it says, these are the case laws that you should set before them. It's the only translation I could find, and I don't know if it's a translation or it's a transliteration or if it's whatever. But I checked 15 different translations, and they all say things like judgments, ordinances, regulations, laws, and so on. Nothing about case law. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that. But it, and Tommy and I have been talking about that this week and talking about the law and so on. And so we're going to start off today. These are the scriptures I was just reading that were the words judgment and ordinances and laws and so forth. But Mark gave me some ideas on a couple of the Bible Project. And we've played Bible Project videos before. And here are two different videos that I'm going to play. They last 4, 5, 6 minutes. And they're both about aspects of the law. So here we go.
You're most likely familiar with the 10 Commandments in the Bible, stuff we generally take as good advice. Don't murder, don't steal, honor your parents, the list goes on.
And those are just the first 10. There are actually a total of 613 commands, all given to ancient Israel, found in the first 5 books of the Bible, which in Hebrew are called the Torah.
Now, the word Torah is usually translated in English as the law, because it has all of these laws in it. And as you read through them, you wonder, am I supposed to obey some of these, all of these? I mean, what's the purpose of the law?
Well, that translation is kind of confusing because while the Torah has laws in it, the book itself is fundamentally a story about how God is creating new kinds of people who are fully able to love God and love others. And when Jesus taught about the Torah, he said that he was bringing that story to its fulfillment.
So walk me through the story and how it's fulfilled.
So the story begins with God creating humanity who rebels. And God chooses Abraham to bless all of the nations through his family, who end up in slavery down in Egypt, and so God rescues them. Then at Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, like an agreement. And all of the laws that Moses gives to Israel are the terms of that agreement. They're like a constitution. And so some of the laws, they're about rituals and customs that set Israel apart from the nations. Other laws are about social justice or morality. And by following these, Israel would show the other nations what God is like.
Okay, so the rest of the Torah is just the complete list of laws that Moses gives Israel?
No, the rest of the Torah just continues the story. And the 613 commands are only a selection from that original constitution. And even these have been broken up and placed at strategic points within the story. Now pay attention, because you'll see a really clear pattern. Moses gives the first laws to Israel.
Yeah, don't worship other gods, don't make idols.
And then right after that, there's a story of Israel breaking those very laws.
Yeah, they worship the golden calf.
And so Moses gives some more laws, and then you get more stories of rebellion. Some more laws, rebellion again, some more laws, more rebellion, and you start to see the point.
Right, no matter how many laws, they're just going to continue to rebel.
So at the conclusion of the Torah's story, Moses gives this final speech to Israel as they prepare to go into their new home. And he tells them, you guys, I know that you're not going to follow all of God's laws. You've proven to me that you're incapable. And Moses says the problem is that their hearts are hard and that they're going to need new, transformed hearts if they're ever going to truly follow God's law. And he was right. I mean, the story goes on to recount Israel's total failure.
They go into the land, they break all the laws.
Right. Now, the next section of books in the Jewish tradition are the 15 books of the prophets, and they reflect back on the story. For example, Ezekiel, he said that if Israel was ever going to obey the law, God's Spirit would have to transform their hard hearts into soft hearts. And Jeremiah said that's when obedience to God's commands wouldn't feel like a duty, but they would be written deep in their hearts. And Isaiah, he promised a future leader, Israel's Messiah, who will lead all of the people in obedience to the law. Now, in Jewish tradition, all of these books together are called the prophets, even the historical books, because they're continuing the story told from the perspective of the prophets.
Okay, so we have the law and the prophets, and they're telling one connected story about God's desire to bless the whole world through a people, Israel, who it turns out needs a new heart.
Yes, and Jesus saw himself as continuing that story. So he agreed with the law and the prophets when he taught that it's out of the human heart that come the most ugly parts of human nature. It's like the default setting of our hearts is opposed to God's law. But Jesus also said that he came to solve that problem, and in his words, to fulfill the law.
So what does he mean there, to fulfill the law?
Well, first he said that the demand of all of the laws in the Torah could be fulfilled by what he called the Great Command, that we are to love God and to love others.
So that seems pretty easy. I mean, we all want to love.
Well, we think we want to love. But Jesus showed how love is far more demanding than we realize. So he quotes the law, do not murder. And he says, yes, not killing someone is a very loving thing to do. But then he also says that when you treat someone with disrespect or when you nurse resentment against them, you're also violating God's moral ideal because you're not treating that person with love. And so Jesus said true love ought to extend even to our own enemies. So even though this command seems very simple, Jesus showed how our hearts are not currently equipped to fulfill even this basic command of God to love others.
And that's kind of a downer.
But where Israel failed, Jesus brought this story to its fulfillment. As Israel's Messiah, he fully loved God and others, and he showed all of the nations what God is truly like. He did this through his acts of compassion and mercy, and ultimately by loving his enemies even unto death. And after his resurrection, he told his followers that he would send God's Spirit to transform their hearts so that they could follow him and fulfill the purpose of the law, to love God and to love their neighbor. So this fulfills the story of the law and the prophets, or in the words of the Apostle Paul, the one who loves fulfills the law. This video was made possible by over 13.
You're most likely.
Okay, any comments about that first video? They did show one thing that he said, or they said, Israel would sin and then God would give them more laws, and Israel would sin again and more laws. I'm not sure I see it that way. Seems to me that the law was all given at once, but maybe not. Everybody got a comment on that?
Off the top of my head, I think Yahweh intended all the laws to be given at once, but of course, with writing and how they were established, if memory serves me, I think some laws were only going to take effect once they took possession of the land. So
Yeah.
not all law was given at once. I would think, based on the fact that some law, for example, the gleaning of their fields and leaving, the corners unharvested, I think those were things that were only going to take place once they came into the land.
Well, I think that based on what he said what the video said, he started out in Eden, and he just said, "Don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may eat of everything else," which included the tree of life. I mean, that was a commandment. So you can go through all the lives of the patriarchs, etc., and they, he mentioned that the law given on Sinai was part of the covenant with Israel. I think he mentioned that. So just based on reading, if you read through Exodus, you find certain of those specific statutes and judgments were given, and then you find a lot more in the book of Exodus. You find different ones or more in the number in Deuteronomy. So I don't see. I think that the giving of the law, if you start out with the Ten Commandments, it's a big umbrella effect that leads to other things. The same way that Jesus said, "You've heard about murdering. I tell you, if you even think about hate, then you've broken that law." That was not shown in, the Torah, the giving of the Torah. I'll stop.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to realize that of those 613, a lot of them were about how a nation should behave. They were laws for a country, as opposed to, if you will, moral laws. And saying opposed doesn't quite work there, but
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
one example, Jim, of what you're saying is that there were a lot of health laws teaching the Israelites how to live, among themselves, and how to, for instance, you were supposed to take your bodily waste outside, bury it. There was a law that said if a mouse gets in an earthen pot, you're to destroy the earthen pot, but if it gets in a steel pot, you're supposed to wash it. Different ways that, and remember, these people are a slave nation. They knew nothing except work 12 hours, 7 days a week, or whatever it was. They knew absolutely nothing. So when they came out of Sinai, God gave them laws like what you just said, is how to survive. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I want to point out that Exodus 24:3 says Moses went and repeated to the people all the commands of the Lord and all the rules. Now, does that mean just the 10 commandments, or does that mean, 20 through 24?
I think it means all of them. Not
Right.
just the 10 commandments. I mean, he brought the 10 commandments down, and he destroyed the 10 commandments because the people were worshiping the golden calf. Then he went back up on the mountain, and God gave him everything: how to build the temple. I mean, how to build the tabernacle. So that's the way I look at that, Rod.
But here's the bottom line, and the people say to this, all the things that the Lord has commanded, we will do. So it seems, it seems to be that's the deal. That's the deal that they made.
Yeah.
And then Moses took blood and dashed it on the people, in verse 8 there. This is the blood of the covenant. So this is Moses' covenant that we have here.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, I've got another one here I'm going to play.
You're most likely familiar with the 10 Commandments in the Bible, stuff we generally take as good advice. Don't murder,
Is that
don't
the same
steal.
one? Wait a minute.
You're most likely familiar with the 10 Commandments.
Here we go.
If you start reading the Bible from the beginning, you'll get about halfway through the second book, Exodus, and you'll come to a bunch of ancient laws.
Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that.
Now, these laws are all written in the literary style we call prose discourse, and they're found all over the second, third, fourth, and fifth books of the Bible. There's over 600 laws.
And since reading ancient law code isn't something you and your friends do a lot, odds are you're going to struggle. So, let's talk about how to read the law in the Bible.
So the first thing to remember is that the Bible is not a behavior manual with a complete list of what to do and not to do to make God happy.
Right, the Bible is an epic narrative. But in the story, God does tell people what to do.
For sure. The story begins with God's plan to rule the world through humans who will trust him and live by his wisdom. And here we find the first divine command in the Bible.
Don't eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, because the day you do, you'll die.
But the humans take the authority to know and define good and evil for themselves, and it's not good. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they're exiled from the garden.
Okay, so this was the first law in the Bible?
Well, it's the first divine command, and it invites people to trust God and live by his wisdom. And so while it's not part of the laws given to Israel, it does foreshadow them, because those too are invitations to trust God's wisdom.
So when do the laws of Israel come?
Okay, here's the story. Israel is enslaved in Egypt, so God saves them and then invites them into a covenant relationship, like a marriage. And the laws make up the terms of that covenant.
And so do we get a catalog of all these laws that God gave Israel?
Actually, no, we don't get all of the laws, only examples. And these have been strategically placed in between stories about how Israel keeps violating the laws.
So I'm supposed to see that Israel's no different than the humans in the garden. They don't trust God or live by his wisdom.
Right. And so it leads to another round of tragedy, violence, and death.
And it ends in exile.
And so while the laws are good and show God's wisdom, they also expose Israel's inability to be God's faithful partners.
I'm following. But when I read the laws, I find a lot of strange stuff. Like not allowing clothing to be made of two different fabrics. Like how does that show God's wisdom?
Okay, so it's important to realize that many of these laws are ancient ritual symbols that set Israel apart, that is, made them holy. So some laws made Israel distinct from neighboring nations, while other laws kept them away from things that in their culture symbolized death, disease, and moral corruption.
Okay, but what about all of the ritual killing of animals?
Sacrifices were also ritual symbols that connected people to God. Since you, a mortal, can't ascend up to God's presence in the heavenly temple, a blameless animal that was offered could go up in your place, covering for your failures so you can know you're accepted by God.
I see. But not all of the laws are ancient rituals. Some of them are just about being a good person and treating others well.
Well, yes, but these laws aren't just about being good. They're about justice, which is a big deal to God. On the first page of the Bible, we learn that every human is made in God's image and is worthy of dignity. And these laws apply that ideal in Israel's day. In fact, these laws still underlie many of the concepts of justice and equality that we take for granted today.
But some of the laws don't seem just, like laws that allow for slavery.
Well, if you look at those laws in their ancient cultural context, you'll see that God's working with Israel as he finds them, pushing them towards justice. So slavery isn't abolished, but it is undermined. For example, Israel was supposed to reenact the Exodus liberation by releasing slaves and forgiving all debts every 7 years. This was revolutionary in the ancient world.
All right. Now, what about all the laws about Sabbath rest on the seventh day and all the 7-day feasts? I mean, what's up with all of these sevens?
Yeah, so these laws about sacred time are all connected to the first creation narrative in Genesis. God brings order out of chaos in 6 days that each have a clear beginning and end. But when you get to the 7th day, it has no end. That's because it's pointing to the ideal of humans partnering with God in his rule and rest. All of these 7-day feasts are rituals that symbolize humanity's true purpose and future hope.
Okay, so all of these laws given to Israel can fit into those basic categories.
Yes, and each category expresses a core ideal of God's wisdom. And the laws show how those ideals should be applied in the culture of ancient Israel.
But as the story makes clear, Israel failed at fulfilling the law over and over. How is God going to get humans to trust his wisdom?
Well, Moses and the prophets after him trusted that one day God would transform the human heart, so people can be faithful covenant partners who trust his wisdom. And that brings us to the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Right. He was the faithful covenant partner that Israel and all humanity was made to be, but has failed to be. Jesus lived by the divine ideals underlying the laws. And he taught that the laws are all fulfilled when you love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
And Jesus promised that God's Spirit would come and transform his followers so they too could live this way.
And so, when followers of Jesus read these laws today, we need to remember they were given to Israel in their ancient cultural setting. You couldn't follow many of them even if you tried.
But what you can do is see God's wisdom in the laws.
Right, and trust that God's Spirit can guide you to follow that wisdom as you learn to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. If you start
That
Thanks,
just,
Skip. That was
yeah,
great.
that
Good
was-
study.
that was quick, wasn't it? Okay, so let's continue talking about the law. And one of the things that they said and is they use the word underlying, which I use the term meaning behind. I'm not sure how you all say that, but there's an underlying message that's under these literal letter of the law things. And Jesus gave us several examples on the Sermon on the Mount. The law is much deeper than the letter. And so many people, Christians, don't like the law because they can only see the letter. I say because, I probably shouldn't say that, but they don't like it. They only see the letter of the law, and they don't see that God is teaching man how to live with each other, how to treat him, how to worship him, based not just on these letters, but on this underlying principle. I like the way they phrase that, of the law. So the law is one of the most persistent points of contention among Christians.
Well, Skip,
Yeah, Barb.
these 613 laws, are they laws that when Moses spoke of them, that uh, did he say, thus said God, such and such and such? Is that what these 613 laws are?
Well, an example is here in chapter 21 of Exodus, where he says to Moses, "These are the judgments which you shall set before them." You know, it's not necessarily a "thus saith the Lord," but you know, it goes through how to treat people. And in chapter 22, I really like chapter 22 because it does something that our law doesn't do today, and that is restitution. Well, it's in part of 21. I think these are thus saith the Lord laws. You know, these are the judgments which you shall set before them. These are the laws you shall set before them. And he goes in, he talks about if you have a servant, he's going to serve for 6 years and then he goes free. So I don't know if that's answering your question or if somebody else wants to take this on, because I think all of these laws came out of the mouth of God, personally.
The 613, were counted by Maimonides, who lived, I don't know, about 1,000 years AD. And he figures that's how many there were. Some people dispute it, but there's a lot of them anyway.
Okay, so we run into a question. Which Old Testament laws should we keep today? Some may ask whether it's okay to wear wool and polyester. Is this a violation? I was challenged by this gentleman the other night that had broken the law of usury for 30 years. And I reminded him that the law of usury talks about don't charge interest to poor people. Well, anyway. So I don't know, this disagreement went a little bit deeper, but I'm not going to bring it back up, and I don't think he will either. But in Deuteronomy 22:11, this is where this law says not to wear a garment that has mixed fabric, such as wool and linen. And I remember Ron and Ted Armstrong telling me about there were men in particular who would cut the nylon, the elastic out of their socks because that was mixing fabrics. And there have been people down through the years that have cut off a hand. Because if your hand offends you, cut it off. Well, obviously, there's a meaning behind that law. The letter says cut the hand off, but God never meant for anybody to cut their hands off. The law behind that, it was if your thought process is making you do things that you shouldn't do, stop doing those things. Repent, and so on. So many people ask, which Old Testament laws should we keep? I contend we should keep all of them that we can recognize a hidden meaning, if you will, or an underlying feeling. What do you all agree with that, or am I out here on a limb with a saw?
There's some people who believe that we don't know how to keep the Torah laws, and so that's why they read what they call the Mishnah. That's supposed to be the oral law, but it's endorsed by the Sanhedrin. Now the Sanhedrin goes all the way back to Numbers 11. But of course there is no more Sanhedrin. But it went into non-existence. About a couple centuries into past Christ.
The Mishnah and the Talmud is essentially case law, Rod. That's what led to this whole discussion.
Yeah, the Talmud is a discussion of the Mishnah,
which is case law, which is not the law itself. It's man's interpretation of what they think the law should be applied, how it should be applied.
Well, to the Orthodox Jew, it's enough.
Yeah. Okay. So some people, many Christians, I try to use percentages, but I've got a friend that tells me I can't use percentages because all percentages are made up on the spot. So anyway, a little humor there. Some people make a distinction between the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law. Like was said earlier, I think maybe it was Mark. All of these are laws that God laid down. And then I know Jim was talking about some of the laws were for the nation, some of the laws are for individuals, but all of them can relate in some way or other if we will look deep enough. If we'll look at what did God mean when he said, build a parapet around your roof? He meant take care of your neighbor. Don't let your neighbor come over to your house and fall off the deck and get hurt. And so on. There's Susan. Okay, so many Christians make a distinction between the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law. I don't know how you separate it. God gave Israel a copy, if you will, of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. But all of those laws, in my opinion, were in effect from creation. The Ten Commandments were in effect from creation. But you know what? What would Adam and Eve covet? Nobody else had anything. You sure couldn't have adultery. You only had the two people. But there was a law against murder from the very beginning.
Well, Yeshua the Christ said that not one jot or tittle would pass from the law until all was fulfilled, and this is everything in the law. And of course, modern day Christianity believes that Christ fulfilled the law, and yet we understand in our culture that no, that comes when he returns. and he establishes the kingdom of, God, and you get to the end of the age. That's when everything will be fulfilled, when Yahweh's intention and desire for all mankind to live with him in eternity is fulfilled. That's the fulfillment.
Yeah.
All is not fulfilled, so the law, nothing in the law is done away with. But as you mentioned, what's the intent and purpose behind all the laws? And as those videos indicated, or one of the videos, it's about the relationship that we're to have with God and with one another. That's the general storyline, and that's the two great commandments: love God and love your neighbor as yourself, of which all these laws are a part, as you brought out. And that gets lost in the way modern churchianity, because they say, well, the law is nailed to the cross and done away with, because to them the law means I believe in Jesus and I can do what I want.
Michael, I think one of the big problems is that when people read that fulfilled, they're they're changing the meaning of the word. I mean, if I drive 70 miles an hour down Interstate 40, I'm fulfilling the law. So does that mean the next time I get on the interstate, I don't have to do it because I've done away with it because I fulfilled it? Just doesn't make sense. I mean, basically, he kept the law.
Right. I mean, you can go further and say till all is fulfilled as far as the law goes. But we know that Yahweh's intention and desire with the law is that all people everywhere will be his people forever. There'll be no more war or suffering, and none of that's fulfilled yet. It's not going to be fulfilled during the age of man. It's not going to happen yet. So all can't be fulfilled. So then where does the law fit in? The problem is that modern Christians don't think beyond, well, Christ fulfilled everything, and all I have to do is believe in Christ, and that's it. I don't have to keep the Sabbath. I don't have to keep the biblical dietary laws. I can do what I want. But it's funny how they can then cherry pick. Well, we don't want to commit adultery. We don't want to murder. So there's a couple of laws we'll keep, but the rest of it's all thrown away and done away with because Jesus fulfilled it all, which doesn't make any logical sense to me.
Yeah, I think, when, and I'm not sure. I've not been a Baptist or Church of Christ or, any Bible studying church other than this one. But I wonder if when someone who believes in studying and going by the things that are in the Bible, they still say the law has been fulfilled. The law is no longer required, if that's the right word. And yeah,
Skip,
Jim. Yeah.
you meet with these people a lot. How do they think then that they can sin?
10 Commandments.
Well, yeah, but that's transgression of the law. I mean, then there's a law.
Well, and that's what they make this distinction between the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law. They believe the 10 Commandments are valid, but the rest of the law is not. Well, okay, that means that I can eat pork and shrimp, and I don't have to. This blows me away. I don't have to set aside 7 days special to worship God. I don't have to do that, or 8 days. Really? You don't have to do it? Wouldn't you want to? Isn't it a good thing to set aside a day in the spring to be thankful that Jesus Christ died and shed his blood and saved us? Isn't it okay for you to have a specific week where you concentrate more on getting sin out of your life / leaven? Isn't it okay to set aside a law to be thankful that God gave us his Holy Spirit? Isn't it okay to, I mean, I can go through all of the holy days, and it really blows me away that the people who want to do away with the law are doing away with days set aside to worship God. Now, they set aside a day in December to worship God, to celebrate the birth of Christ. They set a day aside in the spring to celebrate and worship God on a day that they believe that is the anniversary of when Jesus was resurrected. Why is it okay? Why do they feel it's necessary, if you will, to observe those two things? But
Because case law.
okay.
No, seriously, case law. Why do they keep Christmas and Easter? Because thousands of years ago, those days were grafted into, the Christian way of life. They were grafted in, and that became case law. The 7th-day Sabbath was done away for Sunday, which was the first day of the week. That became case law. That becomes more. That's the deal with case law. The Talmud and the Mishnah, that takes precedence over the Constitution. That becomes more important. That's how you get Christianity thinking that the most important days of the year are Christmas and Easter. Forget the 7th-day Sabbath and forget about the feast, the Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles. That's been superseded by case law, which is why I think subliminally you had a knee-jerk reaction to the idea that this is case law. No, it's not case law. Case law is what mankind wants to look at God through. God's law is his law and his word, which tells us Yahweh's nature. But mankind always wants to make God into their own image and their own likeness, so they establish case law. And we're going to recreate God and what he is and what his nature is like to be a God that fits our ideas of what we want God to be. And that's been the legacy of mankind's nature since the garden. Hasn't changed up till this moment. That's the nature of mankind. So I understand the knee-jerk reactions get to the idea that Yahweh's law is case law, because it indicates that, well, that means that mankind can decide, what God is like. And then that's how you get, the kind of religion that we have today, having a form of religion, but having no true power behind it.
Yeah, Ron had a saying, God never made a law that was not good for man. And if you look at the law of God that way, then you look for the meaning. How does this apply to me? Well, okay, this one doesn't. It doesn't apply to me there's no way I can find how this law would apply today or would apply to me. But
my girls are going to be going through this very chapter in 21 because they've got friends of theirs and people they know that are discounting the law of God, saying it can't possibly be legitimate because it talks about slavery and what God allows in terms of slavery. And that our modern view of slavery is that any kind of slavery whatsoever is evil and wrong, and therefore God can't be a righteous, just God. So we're having to go and deal with, well, if this isn't a law of God, why does he, ask, these laws regarding, slavery, when we think today that, slavery is something that is a wholesale evil and the worst sin that anybody can commit. So those are the issues that they want to bring up, and it ties directly into this because there's, if you believe in case law, then you can pick and choose what you want to keep and what you don't want to keep and what you want to throw out and what the law of God is. So I guess I'm not making any sense, but
Yeah, Michael, good example. Today, if I do something wrong, they'll put me in a cage, right? Case law back then, they'd make me a servant for stealing that stuff if I couldn't pay it back. Plus, then I was that guy's slave, his servant for a certain period of time.
Plus, there would be restitution.
Yeah.
and that's what we're missing today. I mean, we're missing a lot of things, but there
Yeah,
is
that would
rest.
de-incentivize the idea that you could become a career criminal.
Right.
Well, yeah, after about 7 years of working for somebody because I, at the extreme, stole a donut, uh, you know, I probably wouldn't steal a donut again.
Right. And so for some reason, Christians distinguish between the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law. And that's what I was saying. When you throw the rest of the law in there, you're throwing in holy days. And of all the things that shouldn't be thrown away is the holy days. But we don't like the Jews. And the holy days were just given to the Jews. Well, that's not right. But anyway, so some churches believe the Ten Commandments were also nailed to the cross, but they were all brought back except one. Anybody want to take a guess at what one it was that wasn't brought back?
It was the Sabbath.
Exactly. It was the Sabbath. All the rest of them, all of Christianity, I say all, that's hyperbole, I suppose. All of Christianity believes that you should observe the Ten Commandments, but not the fourth. And don't anyway. So you've got the law of God on one hand, you got the law, what they call the law of Moses on the other hand. And if what they call the law of Moses can be identified as the law of God, we should keep it. But the law of Moses has been done away, so there's no obligation to keep that law. Others distinguish between the moral law and the ceremonial law, and try to make the distinction based on whether or not it's ritual to do whatever. And the reason for the rituals is for ceremonially cleanliness. The blood of bulls and goats has never done away with the sin. It's all ceremonially. Okay,
Which
so
begs the question of why then? Why the ceremony? What does that do? Well, when you're dealing with flesh that cannot understand spiritual reality and spiritual principles, you create physical ritual to try to teach them what the spiritual truth is behind what it is that they're doing. Which Christ, in his, explanation, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. I'm telling you, you so much as look on them with lust, you've already committed adultery. And in the same way, the physical sacrificial law, the ceremonial laws, as it were, they were teaching us the kind of heart that Yahweh wanted mankind to have in terms of what was necessary to maintain the kind of relationship and what sin does to break that bond that we're to have, and that all the physical things that were required to cleanse us of our iniquities is never gonna. It's an impossible way to have a relationship. So the flesh isn't gonna achieve it, and again, all of that points to Christ and his sacrifice and the fact that he's our Messiah, so that we can have a relationship with the Father through him, because that's what was necessary in order to redeem mankind back to the Father.
yeah, people ask, do I have to do this or not? Most of them, the answer is not. But let's say that of the people who really question, do I have to do this or not? That's not the question. The question is, what does this law mean? What's the underlying principle? And too few people ever get around to asking why. Why was that law given? And it's really the key to understanding why God gave those laws. Some of them were given, as was said earlier, some of them were given because the slaves didn't know how to act. They didn't know that they were supposed to bury their waist. They didn't know that they were supposed, all of the things that are in that 613 or however many there were. I don't know if he counted right or not. But if you go with the premise that God would not give to man a law that was bad for man, then you ask, what's the purpose of this law? How does it apply? How does it work in today's society? You can look, how did it apply in their society, but that's not what's important to us, other than the fact that we can learn stuff. God didn't sit back one day and say, these people need some laws. And so I've got to give them some laws. And these laws are going to teach them what's right and what's wrong. So here we go. This looks like fun, so I'm going to make it wrong. All of the fun laws out. It wasn't an arbitrary decision. God made man. He knows man. And the scripture is God's instruction book. It's just that simple. It is our instruction book. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but you hopefully you get my point. God, having created man, began to communicate with man a way of life and things that were good for man and to save him from hurt and trouble and heartache that might come his way. So God, when he speaks to man, tells man what's good for him. And he may tell it in a negative way. Don't do such and such because it's bad for you. Do thus and such because it's good for you. But there's a problem because as we read through the law, we're going to sometimes find some laws that we go, oh, that one bothers me. What about the one that says to, was it stone your teenager that won't obey you? There's going to be some in there that are deeply and profoundly troubling. And what Rhiannon and them are going to be talking about today, some of them apply to slavery. In Exodus 21, yeah.
Skip, I'd like to bring in when Moses and the people came out of Egypt. Eventually, the people had so many conflict going to Moses, and Moses said, well, this is too much for me to handle by myself, so I'm going to elect, I think it's 70 people to make judgment.
Yeah,
Why
that's
would,
the Sanhedrin.
well, to make the judgment, and hopefully those judges should bring in those 613 laws to remember to help him to make the judgment. And the people, had questions. That's all I got to say about that.
Yeah. In verse 20 here in Exodus 21, it says, if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he lives a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money, because the guy owed him. We have to figure out, how does this apply? Does it apply today? When you read that, it kind of creates a personal crisis. How does a God who is so good take such a callous look at man and see him treated as chattel and property in this way? So the purpose of this law shows that it should be presumed that the man died through some other cause if he didn't die the first 2 or 3 days. So all of the penal laws should be considered, by he is his money, means that the master had a monetary interest in the continued life of this servant. So he didn't kill him on purpose. It was an accident. Otherwise, he's losing money. So, these are some of the laws that sometimes don't make sense because we can't see the underlying cause.
Thanks, Skip. That was very, very well said about that one.
Wow. I thought I was mixed up. No, thanks, Jim.
Well, if I can intervene on this a little, I
Please.
think God gives us, as I'm, on my hobby horse again about the family, God gives us the family to help us to understand his mind, because any of us who've had children and been responsible for disciplining those children and teaching them and trying to instruct them, we know that you love those children, but you also know how important it is to have rules that will guide them so that their life on beyond the family is good and positive and productive. And most of us are of an age where we were raising our children at a time when our culture and society was changing and was telling us that you didn't have, you shouldn't be doing these things to your children. You shouldn't be spanking them, or you shouldn't be restricting them. They need to have more freedom, and so they grew up with kids whose parents, you always heard your kids saying, well, so-and-so's mum doesn't make them do that. And your answer always had to be, well, I'm not their mum, but it got more and more difficult to hold the line with your kids, even though you knew it was the good and right thing to do. It's not easy. And so, as Barb mentioned, well, no, it may not have been, somebody mentioned about the 70, having the Sanhedrin and whatever. At some point, parents began to think it was, or find that it was just easier if you could just send them to school and expect the teachers to do all that hard work that you didn't really want to do, because it was actually a hard job being a mom. And so you began to let go of some of those things, and you looked around what others were doing, and you began to think, well, you compromised on what you did. And it became easier to let go of the rules, because it's difficult emotionally and physically to enact those things, and balance it with knowing in your heart that what you're doing is right and good for your children. And we now live in a culture where, not only the discipline of young people, but faith culture has let in things to where people feel like, like we have young people now who feel like they're adults and in the working world and whatever, but they simply don't have some of the character and whatever ethics maybe to function in the adult world the way that is the best and profitable for both themselves and for everybody. And in our church cultures, it's become the same, where the rules have been loosened, and you get used to that. And so then you get to a point where when rules are enacted, And I remember this with our own kids. At times it's just so tiring you felt like you were always on their case, and you kind of loosen things up for a while. And it doesn't take very long, and things start to get out of hand. And you realize, no, we have to have a sit down and have a talk about, how everybody's behaving, and how however the kids are treating each other, and how they're responding to you, and their pushback, and all these things that teenagers do. And you have to rein everybody back in, and the resistance is much greater when they have had that freedom for a window of time. And it's like, what do you mean? You're putting these rules back, in place. And so they begin to the perception of the role of the rules loses meaning, in that they no longer see it as structure that is good for you and gives you direction, and it's done out of love. They begin to push back because they resent it, because they've had that taste of freedom and whatever. And we see it all filtered out through all of our society, and particularly in our church cultures. Once you've had those opportunities to live that looser lifestyle and have misbehaviors accepted and not restricted, then anybody who comes in promoting any kind of rules and restrictions is seen as a hard line, and is questioned as to whether, why are you saying I have to obey these rules to get in order to have salvation? And it's easy to distort all that and have it twisted together. And finding our way out through all that morass is just, it's difficult, harder and harder these days than it ever was. Sorry for rambling.
I'd like to interject here too. That was very good, well put, Jill. And I'd like to add too is that we no longer, as a nation, or even sometimes as churches, look. Hopefully not the Church of God, but churches in general don't look to the Bible as the true Word of God that's we can depend on. Because the argument they give to me is because it was written by man, and man has interjected all this into it, and all the wrong scriptures and are in error. So many they feel are inerrant. But I think that's basic to the problem as well, is not accepting the Bible as God's word.
Well, yeah, you're exactly right, Vicky, Ma. Case law, once again, I mean, how many people do we know today, to draw an allegory to what you just said, say, well, the Constitution was written by slave-holding white men that don't understand the modern world, and therefore we just have to throw the Constitution away and create a whole new set of laws that are kind of built upon the Constitution, but actually better reflect, the modern world we live in. I don't know how many times I've heard, leftists, Democrats, and progressives, quote unquote, talk about the need to revamp the foundational law because that world was written by racist white people, and it no longer has application in the modern world. And that's what mankind has done to the scriptures. I mean, what these people are doing to the Constitution, mankind's done to the law of God time immemorial. That's just man's nature. It doesn't want to be constrained by any kind of law. If you think about it, mankind wants to make things up pretty much as he goes along, to his own personal benefit and to the exclusion or harm of others if it's going to give him a leg up. And that's just man's nature.
Yeah, I wonder if God appreciates the way his law gets smacked around. And it isn't just the law, but God himself gets a bad rep. How many of you have heard somebody say, I really don't like that mean old God of the Old Testament? Richard Dawkins, who is about as low can be, as far as I'm concerned, he says the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. You like that word? He's jealous, proud of it. He's petty, unjust, unforgiving. He's a control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal. I don't even know what that word is. But shall I go on? I mean, I don't want to stand anywhere near this man when he's going off on that. But God is a loving God. Everything that he does is good for man. Now, we understand, or the way we believe is that there's an eighth day where all of mankind, well, it may be on the seventh day, but anyway, I don't want to get into that. We believe that all of mankind who did not have a relationship with Jesus Christ before they died are going to have an opportunity to have that relationship and to choose whether they want to live by God's law or whether they don't want to, without any outside influences, such as what we have today, Satan and his demons, and human nature. And so the point I'm trying to make is that God knows this is not the last day. He knows there's a better world coming. He knows these people are going to be, I'm going to use the word saved. I know it offends a lot of church God people, but he knows that people are going to have an opportunity to be saved. And so he has given us this law to help us get along with each other. Can you imagine what this world would be like if everyone in this world would pick 2 or 3 of the 10 commandments and keep them? How much nicer this world, just a couple of them. And that's what's going to happen during the millennium, as I understand it. Okay. So
that gets the heart issue, which is understanding the intent behind the law, the purpose and reason it was given. Once you understand that, then making principles or judgments based on that law are going to be in perfect harmony with the reason the law was given in the first place. I'll just give I'll give a physical allegory to it. I'll use the Constitution again as an example of what I mean. If we understand the intention behind the Constitution, what was it written for? Well, it was written for the specific purpose of limiting the reach and power of the federal government and how elections are to be done and whatnot. And so if you understand that, when you run into someone that says, well, the Electoral College is unjust and it needs to be gotten rid of. Well, if you understand what the intention behind the Constitution was and why things were written the way they were written, you could get into a correct kind of argument and say, well, if you do that, if you get rid of the Electoral College and the reason it's done, then what you're doing is you're giving, the big states all the power in the country to make decisions for everyone else. And I think that you could look at the law of God and as it was given in kind of a similar view. If we understand the intended purpose behind why the law was given, then there's enough grace and things that are in there that we can act and have and we can make decisions that are going to be in concert with the intention behind the law, and we're not going to contravene the law of God. Does that make sense? Did it make sense with that allegory? I was trying to. Don't know that it did or not.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, an enormous amount of sense in that. Just take, for example, the topic of slavery. When you say that word to an American, it immediately conjures up a perspective of Black people hoeing cotton in fields and being beaten with whips and lynched and this kind of thing. And it is so far removed from God's perspective of why he instituted such a thing. When you look carefully at the rules that were set in place for slavery back in Scripture, it really took care of the homeless problem, if you want to put it that way. It was a way for an indigent person to retain their dignity and retain their ability. They were given a place to live. They were given work to do that gave them dignity and skills, and they were fed and cared for, and so it gave them an opportunity and a window of time to work through whatever their issues that had gotten them into that bad situation. And then when the time was up, there was also an obligation on the slave owner, because what we have come to see or understand as slavery has come as a result of what humanity, how they took the concept of slavery and abused it to their own ends and their own benefit, by using people and using their labor and abusing them. And it was never set up that way. And, because when the time came and you'd served whatever the window of time was, the owner was also asked to give the slave sufficient goods that they could go out and basically get their life started over again. It gave them a second chance to get started in life. And they hadn't had to live on the street for those years. They were fed and cared for and given work and whatever. And then at the end of it, so that the owner who had the benefit of the labor of the slave, they benefited from that free labor in return for room and board. And the slave benefited from it. And then at the end, the owner was asked to help the other person get started on their life. I mean, that is a totally different concept than what slavery turned out to be in this country. Now, not in all cases, because I think there were many people who understood, when people go on about George Washington having slaves, he was a man of faith and of Scripture. I'm sure he probably understood to some degree the intent that God had behind that. But you'll always have people who will abuse rules and regulations and laws to their own effect. So, but it's interesting how that word has such negative connotations today, based on the fact that humanity abused God's instructions for that particular situation.
That was awesome, Jill.
That was good. That was really good.
That's going to be a great thing. I'll be able to, hopefully, if I remember some of it, to convey to the girls, because that's one of the main issues they want to talk about, because they have people that are giving them grief over believing scriptures because of what kind of a God do you worship that allows slavery. And of course, if Yahweh instituted slavery as something that was good, then why did he have to free the Hebrews from it if it was right and good? I think it gets to your point, Jill, that it was something man perverted into something that was it was bondage that they became part of, and not the kind of servitude, that you described well. It was a way for them to redeem themselves, to take an indigent person and give them an ability to not only repay their debt in full, but maybe give them an opportunity to develop skills they might not otherwise have had, and also deal with the homeless issue. That's another great point I didn't even think of before. So that was good. Thank you.
Plus, dealing with the jail issue. How much better would it be to be a slave than to be in jail for nonviolent criminals?
Yeah, it makes 3 hots and a cot under a whole different system.
They were indentured servants. They owed somebody money, or killed their cow, or something, and they became slaves as a result of that. And but like you all said, when we think of slaves today, we think of go to Africa and capture a bunch of people and bring them back over here and you own them. And you know, God doesn't want anybody to be owned. And the slavery that we see in the Bible is exactly what Jill was talking about. And so anyway, okay. All right. Another question that gets asked about the law is the law of Moses still binding on Christians? Okay. And they separate that from the law of God, that the law of Moses is different from the law of God. Or is keeping this law required for salvation? You know, that is, to me, that's one of the biggest mistakes that religious people, churches make, and that is that their doctrines become salvation issues, and they're not. By grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. You can't work, you can't keep the law well enough to be saved, and you know, and so on. But that's one thing that we've done on our Wednesday morning Bible study, because I've asked it 1,000 times when they would come up with, you know, you have to do such and such. I would say, is that required for salvation? And it's like I've scared them. They know the answer is no. It's not required for salvation, and they understand Ephesians 2, 8, 9, and 10. I'm talking about the Baptists that I go to Bible study with every week. They thoroughly understand, and at least they give lip service to know those things are not salvation issues. Now, I don't know if they believe that or not, but they certainly give lip service. So, all right. So if someone asks if this is keeping this law required for salvation, that assumes that there are laws that are required for salvation. But that's not the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law is to teach us how to live, how to be happy, how to have a happy home life, how to treat our fellow man, and how to worship God. That's the purpose of the law. It's not to get you into heaven, if you will. It's not to get you saved, but it's to make your life better. You know, that may not be a very good definition. You know, it's not all wrapped up in a nice bow, but I think all of those things together tell us what the objective of the law is. Okay, let's see. Deuteronomy 25:4, you shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. Letter of the law. Don't muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. If all you do is look at the letter of the law, that's not a law that I need to keep. Not important at all. I don't have an ox. I don't even have any corn. So you have to look deeper. You know, is it a ceremonial law? Is it a moral law? Well, Paul quotes from this law. And in his letter to the Gentile assembly at Corinth, he brings this in as an illustration to well, let's look at the chapter. Let me read some scriptures. 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verse 1. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Paul's talking about himself. Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Which, by the way, should answer, what was going on in Damascus, or part of it. Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? These people in Corinth, he's been teaching them. They are his work, if you will. He said, if I be not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. Other people may not pay any attention to me at all, but you people do. My goal is to bring you closer to Christ. He says, for the seal of my apostleship are you in the Lord. That shows I'm an apostle. I've brought you to the belief in Jesus Christ. You've accepted Christ as your Savior. And he said, my answer to them that examine me is this: don't we have power to eat and to drink? So now we're coming back to this law, don't muzzle the ox that treads the corn. So, of course, they can eat and drink. Everybody can. But in context, Paul is saying, don't I have the authority at the assembly's expense, based on the money you people give to the church, to eat and drink? In other words, to buy a meal when I'm on a trip? Am I not entitled to take some of your money and pay for my expenses? And then he goes on in verse 6, have not we the power to forbear working? And then he talks about soldiers. He says, who goes to war at his own charges? Who in the world is going to join the army and buy his clothes, buy his rifle, buy his food? The draft wouldn't get very far if that's what they did. And he goes on, he says, who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat of the fruit from the vineyard? Or who feeds a flock and doesn't drink of the milk of the flock, or sometimes the meat of the flock? And he says, am I saying that's just my opinion? He says, no, the law says it. Don't muzzle the ox that treads the corn. Now, in verse 9, here's where he quotes it again. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treads out the corn. Why? So that the ox can eat as it's working. And then he asks the question, does God care for oxen? Or did he say this for our sakes? When he said our sakes, he's talking about people who are working to spread the gospel. Does God really care that much about the animal? 1 Corinthians 9, verse 10, he says, for our sakes, no doubt, this is written, for those of us who are out working, spreading the gospel. And he implies there that the ox had little to do with the law, that there's an underlying meaning. But, people like to argue and find little points here and there. Some people.
Well, Skip, I
Yeah.
think that brings to mind the point that we keep making, and that is that those things were written to those Israelites, but they were written for us also. So this is exactly what was said in the video, that there was a cultural context in which they were written. If God would have said you be generous and pay for the preacher that's going around teaching people about Jesus, it would have had no meaning to those individuals several thousand years ago. I mean, in ancient Israel as they were coming out of Egypt. But this had meaning. This had meaning about how you treat not just the ox. Well, what if a farmer said, or a person with corn said, I don't have any oxen, I'll use the goat to pull the mill wheel around and crush the corn out. I'll get around it that way. No, it has greater meaning even to them. But this is how it has meaning. It has meaning to us. How many of us on this call have oxen? There's probably some here who have cattle. How many of them use oxen to tread out the corn or the wheat or the anything? Probably none of us do that. But we have all sorts of different ways to apply this in life. And I think that's what Jesus was bringing to bear when he talked about certain things. That's it.
Yeah, I used to use as an example of this law. Hey, James, we've run out of change. Would you go to Memphis and pick up a few bags of coins? Take your car, use your own gas. If you get hungry, buy your own lunch. But I need you to go, and I want you to go right now. That would be in violation of this law. And Paul is talking about this law how many years after Christ nailed everything to the cross? I say that sarcastically.
So can I that's an excellent example. Exactly the point. I think we should, at least one thing that I've been thinking about for a long time is when we see the term law, we talked about this earlier today. When we see the term law in the 21st century, we want to think, because we live in the United States and how many laws are in this country? It's all codified, et cetera, et cetera. And when we think law, we think what was written down, what is the exactness of it? I think Jesus shows it's way beyond that. And I think that reading some of the writings, like the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, a lot of the writings help us understand that Torah is not just codified lines, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. It is revealing the heart of God, the wisdom of God, and helps us understand that Torah really means the full instruction. Let's use other synonyms, the full instructions, guidance, direction of our Father in heaven. Not just 1, 2, 3, there's 613 of these.
Yeah.
One attribute of the law that you didn't mention, Skip, and you were talking about the law is right, the law is good, and that this is God's intention for us and how to treat, our neighbors and how to have a relationship with Him. That's all true. But the other aspect of the law is it reveals to us what sin is, because without it, we'd have no understanding of what sin is. And of course, sin leads to death. Paul talked about this in Romans chapter 7. Somewhere verse 7 or after, I can't remember, where he talks about the purpose of the law. And it's basically to help us be mindful and understand what sin is and why God wants us to avoid it and think the way that he does, because sin, of course, produces death, and we worship a Yahweh of life. He is the breath of life. That's what he wants for us. And so that's another aspect of the law.
Yeah.
Not case law, his law.
When you look at it just brought to mind one of the old purple hymns, but it's Psalm 119, verse 97. And it says, "Oh, how love I your law. Oh, how I love your law. I meditate on it all day long. Your commands are always with me and make me wiser than my enemies." I mean, does that sound like, how many of us would want to sit down and read through all the congressional laws that have been made in this country for our benefit, to meditate on it and to make us wise? You know, we have totally changed how and what law is compared to the way it was instituted from the beginning. Because like you said, Michael, it helps you understand the mind and the heart of God, you know, and you should read about it and think about it.
Yeah. You know, in fairly simple terms in the Old Testament here about this ox, God lays down a principle for any man who is willing to understand it. It has transcended generations, national boundaries. It's applicable in any circumstance or any man's endeavors, and that is that a man should be paid for what he does. It's that simple. But if you only look at the letter of the law, you don't see that. You don't see it at all. And so, you know, there's a whole bunch of laws that there wouldn't be anything in the world wrong with going back and look at them and meditating and say, okay, how now I know that God gave us this law for our benefit. So how does it fit? And you know, the answer to a lot of them is going to be it doesn't fit today. But there are a whole bunch that do fit today, and this muzzle and the ox is a good example of that. And Christ gave 4 or 5 in his Sermon on the Mount that show us there's more to the law of God than the letter. Now, it doesn't mean that we should ignore the letter, but that we certainly should look deeper into the law, any law, and get its meanings. You know, we've mentioned today the 2 great commandments, but we can tie those back to the 10 commandments very easily. You know, the first 4 teach us how to love God, and the last 6 teach us how to love. Let me back up. The last 4, because the 5th one is a fulcrum law. Now, the reason I say that is that the other 4 on each side are balanced by honor your parents. How do you honor God? First 4 commandments. How do you honor your fellow man, including your parents? The last 5. Anyway, that one was free. It's probably worth what you paid for it. Anyway, so a Pharisee would have been very meticulous, and he would have made sure that the ox wasn't muzzled and that the ox was allowed to eat. Would have been very careful because it's specified in the letter of the law. But it's possible that he deprived the man who followed the oxen out of his wages, cheated him, and said, I've obeyed the law of God. Because the law said don't muzzle the ox, and I didn't. totally ignoring the real meaning of that law. Let's see here. I'm kind of skipping through my notes a little bit. There's a great deal of law in the Old Testament that has no direct application to those of us who are bondservants of Christ today. For example, we don't have oxen. We can't muzzle the ox. Like Mark asked a minute ago, how many have oxen and how many plow with those oxen? Deuteronomy 22 and verse 8 says, and I've quoted this 100 times or paraphrased it. When you build a new house, you shall make a battlement for the roof. And we've talked about this time after time after time. Back then, their roofs were flat in the area around Jerusalem. They were flat, and people went up there in the evening because it was a lot cooler. The day had been hot all day long. But you were required to put a fence around your roof. Well, the meaning of that one's pretty simple, or the underlying principle is protect your neighbors. If you have a deck, put a fence around it, and don't drive 100 miles an hour down a neighborhood street. And you can come up with 1,000 different ways that we should take care of our neighbors. And some of the laws have to do with husbands and wives. Well, what if you don't have one? There were laws about the priesthood. We don't have a priesthood anymore, or at least not one that we know of. The law, much like prophecy, is symbolic, or a lot of it is symbolic. There's an underlying meaning. And so if somebody asks which laws are applicable to the bond servants of Christ today, all of them. But you have to understand that the law, it can be symbolic. So people ask, do I have to do this to be a bondservant of Christ? Do I have to do that to enter into the kingdom of God? A better question is, what does it mean? What does this law mean? That's where the truth is. And when we understand what a law means, we'll be a lot further along in understanding God, understanding ourselves, and maybe knowing a little bit better knowing a little how to be a better servant of Christ. Now, Deuteronomy 22:1. You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep go astray, and hide yourself from them. You shall in any case bring them again to your brother. Well, this has obviously got some underlying meanings. Diane and I have a friend who his 14-year-old daughter was running around with 18, 19-year-old boys. And she was sneaking out of the house. And I found out about it. And I called my friend. And I said, so-and-so I found out on what they were going to do Saturday night. I said, so-and-so, I hate to tell you, is planning on sneaking out of the house Saturday night and going to a big party up at the river. So he asked her if she was going to do that, and guess what her answer was? No, Dad, I wouldn't do something like that. And he got very upset with me. very upset with me. So a few weeks later, I heard same thing's going to happen, and I didn't call him. I didn't say anything because the last time when I told him, I got chewed out real good. So this time, guess what? He caught her, and I got chewed out for not telling him. So I don't know. Maybe I was wrong the second time. I don't know if you all have ever run into anything like that or not, but I probably should have told him again, because then he could have asked her, and then she would have realized she couldn't sneak out of the house. So I don't know. But anyway, you shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep go astray, and hide yourself from them. You shall in any case bring them again to your brother. I did that once. I didn't do it the second time. So I don't know. You're walking down the road, and here comes an animal that you know belongs to your neighbor. Oh, I'm in a hurry. I don't have time. He'll find him sooner or later. I'm not even going to let him know that I saw him, the animal, and just keep on going. But the law says don't do that. Let your brother know that one of his animals is out. And if you can, catch the animal and put it back inside the fence. Deuteronomy 22:2. If your brother is not near to you, or if you don't even know him, then if you find this animal, you shall bring it into your own house, and it shall be with you until your brother seeks after it. And we can see that there's an underlying principle here of, you see that, the guy, well, whatever, you can think of examples. And it doesn't have anything to do with animals. Deuteronomy 22:3, he says, in like manner shall you do with his ass, and so you shall do with his raiment, with all lost things of your brothers, which he has lost, and you have found. You shall do likewise. You may not hide yourself. Don't get behind a tree and act like you didn't see whatever it was. You shall not see your brother's ass or his ox fall down by the way and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him to lift him again. And again, we can see what the underlying principle here is. If you see something that belongs to your brother that's out of place, that fell out of the car as he was driving down the road or whatever, the underlying principle of this law is you are also responsible for your brother's possessions. Here's somebody who's in trouble. Maybe he's trying to get this animal out of the ditch and you're coming along, but you cross over to the hedge so that he doesn't see you. Same principle here. Deuteronomy 22:5. This one, the woman shall not wear that which pertains to a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do that are abomination to Yahweh your Elohim. This is a law that had to do with the pagan celebrations that they had back then, but yes, it applies today. Some people wonder if it's okay to wear a woman to wear slacks. I mean, they take this one, we're human beings. Like I think Michael said a while ago, we take these things too far. And now in today's society, women wear pants. And at one time, boy, it was a no for a woman to wear slacks. Certainly not to church. but our societies have changed. So here again, you look at your current situation and you say, how does this apply? Deuteronomy 22:6. If a bird's nest chances to be before you in the way.
I have a question. I'm
Okay,
sorry to
Matt.
interrupt you.
Sure.
On verse 5. So what did this mean for them? Didn't they all wear robes? Of course, I don't guess we have any idea how this seems like there was a definite ability to tell between a woman's garment and a man's garment.
Well, if you took a theme from The Chosen, if you notice that the men's robes were often, not always, but often short, and the women's ones were always down to the ground.
Yeah, they were more like tunics, right? But is that all that this means for them, for those people in ancient Israel?
I don't think so.
I think you're right. I don't think so. I think could be multiple other things that were involved there. But I just happen to be thinking, what did it mean for them? Anyway, that's it.
There were, I'm going to say several, it may be more like a few laws that seem like today it doesn't make any sense. But the one about a man shall not shave the corners of his beard. Some of the pagan celebrations, the way the men dressed and how they wore their facial hair and so on. If you cut the corners of the beard, that may have made it look like you were celebrating in the worship of Baal or Astra or whatever. So, there are several laws like that to us don't make any sense, but it meant something to them.
Well, also, I think about men, the robes, obviously men did wear robes, and there were men robes and women robes, but I think the gist of it would be not to look like a man, for a woman to look like a man, or a man to look like a woman to pass as maybe a man or a woman.
Good point. Yep. Okay, now let's talk about the what's the word I'm looking for? Nature, taking care of the environment. That's the word I'm looking for. Okay, here's an environmental rule. Back then, Deuteronomy 22:6. If a bird's nest chance to be before you in the way, in any tree or on the ground, whether they be young ones or eggs, and the dam sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the dam with the young, but you shall in any wise let the dam go and take the young to you, that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days. What do you think the underlying principle is here?
Well, I've thought about this one often, that, if you take the mother and the babies, you're destroying the entire thing. It cannot propagate further in the future, so it's kind of like, to me, the one where in the New Testament it says, you can take the guy's cloak, but you have to give it back to him at night, so he doesn't freeze to death. So it's that principle of if you need the food or you need something or whatever, you can take a portion. But if you take, it's like killing the goose that lays the golden egg would be our modern day equivalent of something like that. That the mother always has the potential to lay more eggs and raise more young. But if you've taken both, you've destroyed the entire thing.
Exactly that. The goose that laid the golden egg is a absolute perfect analogy, because when the guy killed the goose to get he only wanted to go in and get all the eggs out of the goose. He didn't get any more golden eggs. But yeah, I agree with you 100%, Jill. I think that it has to do with allowing nature to proceed. But if you take the mother and take it home and cook it and eat it, there's not going to be any more little chicks or whatever these are.
Well, you could also take that, to an economic example that that if there's if you have a business and you owe more money than you can pay, the person you owe the money to could either set up a payment plan where you can continue to run your business and pay off your debt over a period of time, so he gets what he needs and you continue to make a living, or you can just bankrupt the guy and put him out of business totally, and then you've destroyed it, So to me, that's kind of an analogy.
It is. That's a good analogy. You're exactly right. Here's an interesting one. Deuteronomy 22:9. You shall not sow your vineyard with different seeds, lest the fruit of your seed which you have sown and the fruit of the vineyard be defiled. You shall not plow with it. Well, okay, let's stop there. These are two different parts of this thing. So why do you think God has placed this law in front of man? You shall not sow your vineyard with different seeds, lest the fruit of your seed which you have sown and the fruit of your vineyard be defiled. Again, I don't think this has anything to do with growing crops.
Well, it does to them when it was written to them, because
yeah, that's true.
Anybody who's gardened knows how the pollination process allows crops to be cross-pollinated, and you will lose the purity of the strain of your particular things. So you shouldn't put your melons close to your cucumbers or your pumpkins or whatever, because they will get cross-pollinated, and you will, when it says defile, I mean, I don't think it's made in the sense of a human being defiled, for touching a dead body or whatever. It is that the seed will lose its purity and it won't produce the proper. Then if you save seed then from that pumpkin that was next to the cantaloupe, the next year that pumpkin is not going to be the pure pumpkin that it should have been, and it may produce this funky fruit. So as a gardener, I know that was relevant then, but like you say, there's probably much more underlying and deeper meanings too. But they would have understood it because they gardened.
Well, and so would a gardener today. You understand it from the standpoint of the garden, but you also know there's something underlying this thing. I want to see what this word defiled is here. Kodash, sanctify, hallow. Most of it is translated sanctify. Lest the fruit of your vineyard be. I think I'm in the wrong dictionary. No, it is sanctify. It is
forfeited to the sanctuary, whatever that means.
Yeah. It is. It's a primitive root to be clean, ceremonial or moral, appoint, bid, consecrate, and so on. Keep, prepare. Okay. Anyway, that doesn't give me much of a hint, but yeah, you're exactly right, Jill. the letter of the law here makes perfect sense to someone who grows a garden or has a field. But there's an underlying principle that we need to try to figure out what it means and how it applies. And I think this goes along with the don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers in 2 Corinthians 6. And the principle there, the letter, is a yoke is fixed between the two animals, and an ox may go faster than the mule or whatever it is. You're unequally yoked together. That's the letter of the law, and makes sense because you might be going in circles instead of in a straight line. They plow at different speeds. And so God,
this
yeah.
is a really interesting thing. I mean, I think that law is almost an intentional absurdity.
Okay.
Because no farmer would ever do that, because at best you'd be plowing in a circle.
Yeah, good point.
And I think that, but sometimes God just does stuff for a point. Say, well, you're smart enough not to, to know that you can't do this with an ox and a jackass. It's not going to work. But it's a principle. And I think it's more on the principle category than the literal category in that case.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Like you said, nobody's gonna, well, I'm sure somebody's tried it, but it's not typically the way that it's doing. But it all goes together with that, and don't wear a garment of different sorts, and so on. And it's don't be unequally yoked together. Now, I don't think that means well, we always throw this into marriage. I say we. I'm going to right now. It would probably not be a real good idea for a staunch Church of God, letter of the law person to marry a Catholic. Probably not going to work. Or to marry a Jew, a Catholic marry a Jew, maybe. You're going to have problems religious wise. Now, I'm not sure how that works. Anybody got any thoughts on any other ways to look at this?
Can I throw something in?
Sure.
Okay. Well, Paul takes this idea of taking it more from a concrete letter of the law approach to a concept of something bigger, of how can I use what God tells me to make life better all the way around in various situations. Paul goes a little further in 2 Corinthians 6, not only to not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, which, can bring up that in our imagination, that ox next to the donkey, and the fact that that's not going to work, or, the unbelieving spouse or the unequal spouse. And he goes on to say partnership has righteousness with lawlessness. So he compares those two. Righteousness is what we've been called to. And we know that lawlessness is what we've been called away from, because sin is lawlessness. And then he goes on and says, what fellowship has the light with darkness? One of the basic things is when someone's definition of righteousness, what you were just saying about people from two different religious backgrounds, if they can't have an agreement on what righteousness is from the scriptures, from a careful search of what God tells us, in their minds, they're always going to be calling the other person lawless. It's just not going to work. There won't be any confidence, but it's taking it up to the concept level. Where can we see this?
Did we lose you?
No, I just concluded and said that's
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. The law here about the plowing with an ox and an ass together, like Jim said, this may be an underlying principle without a letter. People generally aren't going to do that. And then it talks about the garment of different sorts, such as wool and linen together. These are lessons that God has given us, where we can avoid trouble down the road.
Well, I think in both of these situations, Susan's point was great, and the people hearing that would remember what was said here in Deuteronomy, because when you yoke anything together, you are doing so with the intent to move forward equally in a given direction. And so the focus is to get the job done and to draw in equal parts and put them together so that they each take an equal share of the load to move it forward. They're both directed and going in the same direction. So, that would, and they would, like somebody else said, Jim said, they would have, as a farmer, they would have understood that concept. It's not like they had to be told, because there they were putting an ox and a donkey and somebody had to come along and say, oh, that won't work really well. It was an intuitive thing that they understood. And so in laying this out in Deuteronomy, I think God was asking them to think more deeply about a concept that they already understood. And then with the wool and the linen, that's an interesting thing because I'm into fiber, and wool it absorbs moisture, and but it also traps air against the skin and keeps things warm, whereas linen is a cool weather fiber that you wear when you want the hot air to flow away from your body and cool you. And so you're using two different properties, and they're fighting against one another because they don't work together properly. Because God created them for different purposes. You wear wool in the winter, you wear linen in the summer. And they would have understood that too. And, in fact, you harvest I think you'd harvest the linen in the summer when the plants are in full leaf. And then the sheep you usually shear in the spring. Not in the late summer. So they're even created to occur at different times. And I think God's asking us to look at the fact that he made things differently. Why did he give the three different people 3 different amounts of talents? Because his expectation was the same, in that he was happy that the guy who got 10 made 10, but he was equally as happy that the guy who got 5 made 5. He was only angry at the guy who had 1 and didn't do anything. He didn't expect the guy who he gave 5 to make 10. it's like a recognition that things are created. The donkey is created to do a different job than the ox, and to have the expectation that it will perform at the level of an ox is failure to recognize that God has created diversity, I hate to use that term, within humanity, and we have talents and purposes that are different, like the linen has a different purpose than the wool. And, so we need to recognize that in humanity as we deal with our children and our co-workers. You notice that different people function better in different roles in a job. And so recognizing that and giving them a task that is suited to what they were created for is what brings out the best in people.
Right. Okay. All right, I'm down to the end here. I guess to me, the whole principle of what we've been talking about today, about the underlying principle of the law, instead of asking, must I keep this law today, we should instead ask, what does this law mean? What's the underlying principle? So that's all I got for today. I hope this was an okay subject. We seem to have plenty to talk about, though. Any other thoughts or comments?
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Good study.
I did good too. A lot of good comments.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said there were a lot of good comments. I really enjoyed
Yes.
it too.
Yes, there are always good comments that come from others besides me.
Well, Skip,
Anybody remember?
I want to thank you for going through this. It was very informative for me since I know some of this was because I'd requested it. So thank you very much for such effort for all of us. And for my part, I'm going to be looking at the laws of the Torah. If I'm saying that right, Michael, you can help correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, he had to head out.
With much more interest in how it applies to me today. Look for the spiritual meaning. I think in the past I've looked at these, and probably I'll just admit that I've set them aside because I either viewed them as well, that was for them. It does not apply now, or perhaps this is obsolete and is no longer a thing. But I'm thinking I need to give more attention to this. We'll talk more. I appreciated the comments that many of you had. That helped as well. I'm going to have to leave in a couple of minutes or a few minutes, but I'm going to stay here for just a little bit longer.
Okay.
Well, Tom, keep coming up with good questions like this. This has been a good one.
Well, I think I'm actually going to talk with our pastor about inviting Skip to speak at our church one Sunday. That would be good.
Oh,
I'm
I
serious.
want advance notice. I'm coming to Jonesboro.
I'm serious. I'm going to run this by the guys, so just get ready.
His
I think,
pastor, by the way, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that our discussion and exploration has also helped us to grasp how wisdom is an aspect of what God is doing. I mean, if we think back to the Garden of Eden, where God gave an instruction, a command, or whatever, wasn't that wise? And if Adam and Eve would have, well, let's say Eve, if Eve would have said, I'm going to apply what God said and adjust my behavior, that would have been applying wisdom and faith. And that's the object. God wants a relationship with us. And that's what I think, part of the video that we watched was all about, which was how is God this continuing story going on? And we have seen failures, lots of failures. We've spent 2 years or a year, whatever it is, talking about, you know, Kings, Chronicles, prophets, and we keep seeing this evidence of them rejecting what God has to say and worshiping other gods.
Yeah.
It'd be far better for mankind if the wisdom that comes from paying attention to what God said would be enacted in our lives, in whatever cultural situation we're in, and whatever seriousness of what God has said.
Mark, I think our country's back to worshiping Gaia with all of the climate change and Earth stuff.
Yeah, the Earth Mother. And a bunch of other things. I mean, that is one thing's been emphasized to me, and that is in our story of looking at Israel, is that they rejected God. They rejected Yahweh and would not have him reign over them as their God, as their Elohim. And that just keeps coming back and back and back and back. And they did it with so many of their practices and ideas. I mean, Jeremiah, that I think we were just about to get to, has this example of Jeremiah calling out the leaders and, in fact, all the rich people for letting their slaves go and then thinking better of it and bringing them back. And they were trying to follow, or they were induced to follow what God had said in the law. And they said, "Oh, I don't want to do that. Let me have them back." I think we'll go through that when we go through those chapters in Jeremiah.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Any other comments? I've enjoyed this today.
Skip, if I could, I just want to wish Mark and Jill a wonderful trip. We sure will miss y'all, but I noticed right now it's 6:22 a.m. in Sydney, so maybe you could join us, about 3 o'clock in the morning on next Sabbath, and be able to hear you.
Thanks, Carol.
Yeah, Mark's already threatened to call me at 2 o'clock a.m. my time.
Yeah.
Well, Mark and Jill have to show up. They're required. Attendance is required.
Maybe we'll be suffering jet lag and we will be up at 3 a.m.
You could be.
You probably will be the first time.
I did when I went that direction. I went to Bangkok and ended up walking the streets at midnight.
Goodness.